We're going to move rapidly on to myth number 3, which is green infrastructure will solve the biodiversity crisis in cities. And we couldn't really find a more of an expert than Professor Nick Williams, who is a Professor of Urban Ecology and Urban Horticulture at the University of Melbourne, also on the scientific committee for this event. He works on urban ecosystems because although cities are the cause of many of the world's environmental problems, they also offer humanity great hope for a sustainable future. So with that, let's have Nick come and talk about myth number 3. Thank you.
So thanks, Cathy, and thanks for all the work that you've done for the city and now at the uni, and thanks everyone for being here. It's great to see the turnout. So I was asked to speak on the myth that, well, I'm not actually sure if it's a myth, we'll see, whether green infrastructure will solve the biodiversity crisis. What am I? There we go. Right. So hopefully most people are familiar with the green infrastructure concept. When you sort of go back to its origin story, as Amy was alluding to, the concept sort of came about from this paper by Benedict McMahon, the US landscape architects, I think. And they're talking about green infrastructure being the nation's natural life support system. It's not an urban thing, but it's an interconnected network of waterways, wetlands, wildlife habitats and other things that are providing that support for native species, maintaining processes and sustaining resources and contributing to health of people and communities. Wrong way. What happened then? Another definition is around the concept of green infrastructure, emphasising the quality as well as the quality of urban green spaces, their multifunctional role and the importance of interconnections. So these conceptualisations really talk about it being a planning tool, and it's drawing on landscape ecology and conservation theory and work around that. It's about providing ecosystem services as a primary goal, I guess, and really emphasising the function and benefits of the green spaces and the designed green infrastructure as well. So, and it's emphasising it also that it's multifunctional. And this is also from Benedict McMahon, and they say in the paper that it should be based on sound science and should build on the knowledge of professional disciplines, landscape ecology, urban and regional planning, landscape architecture. So it's a multidisciplinary thing as well, and I'm sure there's a diversity of disciplines in the room, which is fantastic. So when we talk about green infrastructure, it's a whole range of where you find vegetation in cities, ranging from the very large national parks and regional parks, through river corridors, amenity green spaces, down to small things like private gardens and traffic treatments, as well as the more novel, relatively new engineered green infrastructure such as green roofs, walls and facades. So it ranges from small scale to large scale, and when combined it provides a network of interconnected green spaces to provide ecosystem services. But people have also started to think, well, can that provide biodiversity habitat as well? Noting that some of these elements of green infrastructure will be remnant vegetation and they'll be already providing those biodiversity habitat features. But how do we build the other ones, the more designed green infrastructure? How do we increase the benefit of them for biodiversity? Green infrastructure's got lots of synonyms. Here's a few of them. They overlap and they're used interchangeably in different papers and in conversations. You might have some more out there as well that will work. So these are just some. This is urban forest sensu Ian Shears, so everything. Whereas some people also talk about the urban forest being a more narrow definition. And what's happening is that as green infrastructure is being increasingly recognised for its importance to urban areas and cities, cities around the world and governments are developing plans and policies to coordinate, promote, and work out how do we get more green infrastructure in the cities, primarily for the ecosystem services that they provide. And now there's also large corporations like Arup and large NGOs like the Nature Conservancy also looking at these things, and ICLEI as well. So the concept has been taken up very broadly because of its appeal for the benefits that it brings, and that's a whole other talk around for urban areas. But what's also been happening is that green infrastructure is becoming increasingly prevalent in biodiversity conservation policies. So the EU biodiversity strategy talks about green infrastructure in all 6 of their targets. And this is a point made by Schwartz et al. In their review, and the positive relationships between biodiversity and urban ecosystem services are widely implied within the both scientific and policy literature. And there's often a tacit suggestion that enhancing urban green infrastructure will automatically improve biodiversity and ecosystem services. But is that the case? And as Amy was talking about, well, will any green do, or do we need to think about it in a much more nuanced way in its application to green infrastructure? And in Australia, our premier biodiversity strategy has a number of objectives. And objective 9 is enrich cities with towns and nature. And I'm not sure if you... not working? It's that way. Why does it work that way? Anyway, if you... hoping for a pointer, but it's okay. If you read through that little blurb there, they're talking about different ways that enrich cities and towns with nature. And while I will use this ad infinitum to try and get grant money because it talks about using green roofs for biodiversity, I'm not sure that's the best way we should be solving Australia's biodiversity crisis, because I'm not sure, amongst other things, how many of our threatened mammals are going to live in green infrastructure. But the intent is great. It's about connecting people with nature, but it can't obviously be all we do. So, can green infrastructure solve the biodiversity crisis? I used to watch Mythbusters, and I was just thinking about this, and I was thinking that Adam looks a bit like Dave Kendall. But anyway. So this is a literature review by Alex Fazzola, who is a PhD student, now postdoc, of our colleague Scott McIver at the University of Toronto. And they went through a whole lot of studies to try and find the evidence as to whether green infrastructure is benefiting biodiversity. And they compared green infrastructure with conventional infrastructure. So again, no pointer. If you look from the top going down, we've got different types of green infrastructure, so green walls, green roofs, community gardens, roadsides, detention basins. And what we've got here, this is a meta-analysis where they're looking at the effect sizes from each of those studies, and the studies is the study is individually numbered on the left of what they looked at. So, arthropods 251 study abundance, and looked at abundance of arthropods. And if the mean, which is the dot, is to the left on the green infrastructure side of the scale, it's suggesting that's having a positive relationship, whereas if on the other side, it's a conventional relationship, and the variation around the bar, the mean, is represented by the bars. So we can see that overall, if you look at the bottom there, the model for all of the studies, that they found that green infrastructure has a better outcome for biodiversity than conventional infrastructure. So they're comparing green walls with bare walls, green roofs with bare roofs, vegetated roadsides to normal business as usual roadsides, and detention ponds with artificial water bodies. And that's not surprising. We know that if we build a green roof and put vegetation in there, there will be more biodiversity than there will be otherwise. And this is the before and after, rare before and after photos from the Burnley green roof. Using the same example Amy did, our streetscape biodiversity work with the City of Melbourne. This is Docklands Drive. It was paved freehand. We put special biodiversity palette in there to attract biodiversity, and it's another example of where it will be better. But these results can be context and tax specific. We had 4 sites, before after control impact, and but bees made a difference for native bees, but it didn't with birds. So it's taxa specific, and also it depends on what type of green infrastructure you are looking at. It came from the Farrell study as well. They also looked at green infrastructure versus natural counterparts. But this was a little bit more difficult in terms of finding appropriate studies, I think. With green roofs, they compared it to grassland, natural ponds versus stormwater detention ponds, for example. And there was a fair bit of variation in what each of the individual studies were doing. And the meta-analysis found that overall, there was no difference between green infrastructure and natural components. But there's lots of variation in that model. As they acknowledge in the paper, there was difficulties with the comparisons and they were not consistent. And there's relatively few studies for some of the green infrastructure types. Surprisingly, detention ponds was one of them. And so the differences in the effect of green infrastructure on biodiversity, as found in this meta-analysis, was dependent on the green infrastructure type and the taxa as well. And there's different responses in different things. So the natural counterpart for tadpole abundance, for example, much higher tadpole abundance in natural ponds than the stormwater ones, which reflects Kirsten's work, or things she's looking at now. So more research is required in this space. One of the things that we did a while back, and this is again with Scott McIver and Jeremy Lundholm in this instance, was to look at the various claims being made around the benefits of green roofs. And these came from people I term green roof evangelists. Green roofs will save the world, so similar to the myth. And there was a range of things in the literature, in the web, various other places, and we formulated them into a series of hypotheses, which you can see there on the left. And then we went into the scientific literature and looked for the level of support to test those hypotheses. We weren't able to do a formal meta-analysis like Farrell did due to the nature of the studies, but just looking at what's supported and what's not. And so it's where it was looked at. We've got a yes or a no, and the target organisms that we were talking about there as well. So in particular, I'd like you to look at sort of number 3, or number 2 to start with. So green roofs can support species diversity and composition, abundances of organisms comparable to ground level habitats. And all of those studies, apart from one, found that wasn't the case. So green roofs are not acting as those natural infrastructure studies. But then when we look at hypothesis number 3, where green roofs are designed specifically to support biodiversity, have a greater species diversity and abundance than standard green roofs, there's a level of support there which suggests if we start designing green infrastructure specifically for biodiversity, we're going to have a better outcome. And that's what I want to dwell on a little bit. Again, talking about the study Amy mentioned briefly, we did a lot of work, Cara Threlfall in particular, looking at biodiversity of green spaces in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, where we compared gardens, parks and golf courses, and we examined the influence of vegetation, structure and diversity on a range of different taxa. So we had bats, birds, native birds by the magpie, introduced birds, bees, bugs and beetles. And these are all probability of occurrence curves, varying with a number of the vegetation factors, so native tree density, understory volume, and the percentage of native vegetation in the quadrats that we did these surveys in. And the take-home message is that for a lot of the taxa, as you increase, in particular the understory volume, so the vegetation complexity, and the percentage native vegetation, there's a much higher probability of occurrence of a lot of these taxa. Each one of these lines is an individual species. So we've modelled all of the species and how they respond to the vegetation indices. So where we get complex understory and higher percentage, we get lots of native species. So these results suggest we can design green infrastructure for targeting species. But which species do we use or do we target, and how do we do that? This is an example of some work that Amy and I did for Lend-Lease, working out what species, if they're going to put green infrastructure into Melbourne Quarter development down in Docklands, which species should they think about? And we looked at the connectivity of the landscape down there and looked at what species are occurring in different buffers of around the Melbourne Quarter site. And then we used a set of criteria to develop our species that we think we should be designing for the green infrastructure for. And so we want something where additional green infrastructure is going to be useful for the species, so we're not going to target a thing like a noisy miner, which doesn't need any help. There's got to have the potential to reach the site, the habitat and requirements and life history can be met within that precinct, and the species is unlikely to be detrimental. So, we don't want tiger snakes, for example. There's other examples of this. So biodiversity urban design, developed by the folks at RMIT. Around this is a much more quantitative framework and allows you to, quantify those benefits in a way to help the decision making a lot more. And then that's been applied in a recent paper by Holly Kirk and everyone to the Fisherman's Bend precinct, so looking at scenarios with green infrastructure design for biodiversity versus without. So this is starting to develop the processes and the frameworks to be able to design green infrastructure for biodiversity. But then as ecologists, we also need to think about providing the tools to design professionals that will enable them to do that. And this is a bunch of tools, some of which I've been involved with, and we'll be talking about one of them later on. But we're starting to get sort of taxa-specific things, so designing for bats out of the UK, for example. So we have a lot of ecological knowledge now, and we still need to develop more for certain spaces, so comparing green infrastructure to other things, obviously. But we can start to think about how do we design green infrastructure for particular target species. In conclusion, will green infrastructure solve the biodiversity crisis? It won't, because it's not a replacement for natural systems, and our golf course work suggests that, biodiversity work. So that myth may be busted in the green infrastructure, in the Mythbusters way of looking at it. However, green infrastructure will be part of the solution for the biodiversity crisis. It's better than conventional grey infrastructure. But standard green infrastructure, the green spaces we have now, are likely just to continue to support the common urban species we see now, so they may not be adding much to our biodiversity conservation efforts. If we can design green infrastructure to maintain and attract and support more uncommon species and target species, as well as providing ecosystem services, well, maybe this is plausible. But to do that, we need to provide the tools for everyone to be able to design those systems. So thank you, everybody, and I'd like to acknowledge the City of Melbourne, Lab Group, and the partnership. Sit down.
Oh, so many amazing resources and references and citations that are being presented today, which is why we thought we should capture all of this great information in this so-called playbook for urban biodiversity. So whilst, of course, take photos and take notes and get a lot of information, we're doing that as well, and we'll be sharing it all with you afterwards. And my colleagues, Carlin Lee and Tami Carosa, have been busily already synthesising these amazing papers that have been presented so that it's easy for you to just grab the summaries. But I'm going to ask Amy to come back to the stage to join the panel, and then we've got two we've already heard from, and from Dr. Freya Thomas, who's a senior urban forester at the City of Melbourne, and we also have Associate Professor Claire Farrell, who is an Associate Professor of Green Infrastructure at the University of Melbourne, who we're going to break this clicker. we need a little shelf for the clicker. We will ask Claire and Freya to respond first. Their responses to whether these myths have either been debunked or disproven or anything in between. And then we will also allow Nick and Amy to answer a couple of your questions. And do make sure, or if you can, if you've got the ability to use the QR code on your program to get onto the Hahs slides, because there are some great questions that I know I'm going to ask Amy when we get up to her. But I'll start with Claire over here to start with. If you'd like to, very briefly respond to Amy and Nick's presentations, and we'll come to the second question later.
Thanks, Cathy. Well, for starters, I agree with everything they said, which for those of you that know me, maybe you're a bit shocked by that. But I think it is inviting a more nuanced approach to plant selection and thinking about biodiversity. So it's not, a blanket, what was there beforehand, put it back on the green roof and we'll get biodiversity outcomes. And I think for me, as somebody who works more in the plant world and getting green infrastructure to work from a plant perspective in terms of matching it to sites and soils and climate and water availability, that to me is the key message here. So if you are designing something, think about what plants you can support with the conditions that you've created, and then look at what traits those plants could have that could attract biodiversity. And I think what Amy was saying, that exotic plants do have a role. They can extend flowering. I think that's an important message. But also thinking, what are the floral characteristics we need to target certain things, and taking that from what Nick was saying. So, not trying to do everything for everything, but being really specific about objectives. And that also makes for really good green infrastructure. But I enjoyed both talks. Thank you.
Freya?
Here we go. You think I know how to do that by now. Thank you, everyone. So previous to working at the City of Melbourne, I was actually an urban ecologist researcher at RMIT University, and I'm a quantitative plant ecologist. So I guess the way I respond is thinking about some of my research as well. And again, I agree, not all green space is the same. It all matters, but there's differences in the types of green space. And I think that was reflected in Nick's talk as well. Some of the work that I did with my PhD student, Catherine Berthon, was about, firstly, a meta-analysis just about what nativeness is. And she looked through all these papers, and one of the main conclusions was that generally, when you plant native plants anywhere in the world, you get higher biodiversity connections. But one of the main outcomes was that it's actually poorly defined, and it's defined in a whole lot of different ways. It can be social, it can be about space, it can be about time, it can be about political boundaries, and often what we think is native is rarely defined in the first place. And so one of our main conclusions was that what underpins a lot of these conversations is social values. And I think that's really important in the city with all of us who work in the city with people and nature all the time. And it's very important to be quite explicit about, you know, which values we're talking about when we're talking about all these concepts and words. Katie and I also did a year-long pollination or floral visitor study in the City of Melbourne, where we went out every 2 weeks and looked at native and exotic garden beds and looked at the floral visitors to all these different plants. So hundreds of plants through all the seasons, and certainly from that information is really reflected in, you know, the differences in phenology between different species. But it wasn't as straightforward as, you know, all native ones always have the best biodiversity interactions. There were some cracking exotic species out there who do provide a lot of benefits to a lot of species. But we did probably see more specific interactions. So Wallenbergia, which came up in Monique's work as well, you know, you're almost guaranteed to see a little native bee on a Wallenbergia on a hot sunny day, and you won't see honeybees. So reflecting what Claire said as well, I think really thinking about plants as the amazing organisms they are and the traits that they have and the resources they provide, and understanding the sort of species-specific response and being very careful in our selection based on evidence and based on our values and our objectives is a really important way forward. And I think we're getting there, which is really exciting.
Claire, would you like to add any further? I mean, you're obviously well versed and well researched in this area. I thought, you know, to bring in some more of your ideas or concepts that you've been thinking around these two myths of any green will do or green infrastructure will solve everything. No.
I mean, I just find it really fascinating. So I work a lot on the Woody Meadow project, and, you know, it's always a conversation that comes up is, you know, we're doing a Woody Meadow in this area. We'd like to use the EVC that was there pre-development to support biodiversity. And so I just always say to them, let's unpack that. What do you mean? Like, what assumptions are you making about that EVC and what it would provide versus broader objectives for the project? And are you going to have the resources to support that lofty goal? I'm all for you know, recreating, restoring EVCs where you're going to put the resources and the time and effort into doing it. But if we're going to do it in sites where we aren't going to make it suitable for them, it's a waste of everyone's time and a loss of biodiversity if we have just dead plants. So, yeah, I think it's just always been really clear what we're trying to achieve. And if biodiversity is the main outcome, make sure you do your hardest to make it work. And if it's something that you want to achieve as a buyer to buy, then, you know, making diverse mixtures of a range of plants with different structures, different floral resources, different lifespans is probably a good way to achieve it. But again, I am a plant person, so I'm speaking from a maintenance, management and plant survival perspective.
So just taking it all in. I'm going to now ask a couple of the questions that have come through on these slides. There's some excellent questions, and it's, yes, frustrating we don't have loads of time, but we will capture it all and try and respond in this playbook. So I might ask, some of you have got names in them, but most of them on my screen say anonymous, so apologies. Feel free to raise your hand if you're the one that asked the question. There are actually two here for you, Amy. I might just throw them both at you and then you can respond to either or both. So there's a question around, does green need to be green? Apart from the blue, many species have adapted to be built forms such as, and mentions peregrine falcons as well. So there's does green need to be green? And then the other question is, are there any key plant species that provide the best habitat value to the widest range of species? So.
Yeah, two very excellent questions. Maybe I'll talk to the first one first. Does green have to be green? And working with biodiversity, so Nick and I are part of a global research collaboration looking at what are the important life history traits that are affected by urbanisation across multiple taxa. And one of the really striking things that came out of that analysis was the importance of opportunities for reproduction. So we recognise this really well for hollow dependent fauna, and we have really good information now about how to build a bat box for particular bat species, how to build nest boxes for birds and for possums. But what we haven't really, what we don't regularly incorporate is there bare soil? Is there woody debris? Is there nest sites for other types of nesters present in what we're planting? So I think paying attention not just to are we putting in the right plants, but are we creating opportunities for that whole of life cycle beyond just the vegetation? And in terms of are there kind of powerhouse plants that can do everything? Freya mentioned Wallenbergia, which is an excellent example. And I think it's hard to answer that because really biodiversity is so complex. So, but we are doing a lot more research now. So Monique's study, Katie's study, I've been involved in studies mapping these interaction networks across Melbourne in lots of different contexts now. And as they start to pool and build, I think we'll start to see some repeated patterns emerging, and that's something that we'll be able to take forward. But at this stage, I wouldn't want to put forward a candidate and sell out the Bunnings version of it.
I'll ask Nick these two questions, and then maybe if you two wanted to respond to any of them. But you've got about 6 or so minutes left of questions, so get something into the system if you'd like, or we'll see if we can get a hand up. But so Nick, the two questions here I can see for your presentation. One, and I've got names on these ones, Alicia Otto and then Heather Stewart as well. Thank you for playing along. So the first question is around, can we bust the myth that sport and green infrastructure can't coexist? Ooh, I love that one. Then the second one, different, but just to give you two at the one time. If we focus green infrastructure on target species, do we run the risk of favouring charismatic or lovable species? Ooh, two good questions. Well, there is a like button, but not an ooh button. But anyway, so there you go.
Yeah, I think we need that ooh button. Excellent questions. So green infrastructure and recreation. There's a lot of potential for conflict here, as any council officer in the audience, and I'm sure there's lots of them, and I suspect the questioner may be a council officer around this. So how do we, it goes to the multifunctionality of green infrastructure, and I guess you need to think about, well, what are the functions you are providing for, and the cultural ecosystem service of recreation is also a very important ecosystem service provided by green infrastructure. I think we need to realise that there's going to be some ecosystem services that are incompatible with biodiversity and others that are or less compatible with biodiversity and others that are going to be more compatible with biodiversity. And I think the recreation one might be one of the ones, particularly with active recreation. So I'm thinking of your football ground, which doubles as a dog park, which doubles as a dog play pit and a children's sports oval at the same time for the local school, it's going to be pretty difficult to provide much in the way of biodiversity on that bit of green infrastructure recreation. But think about the park it's in and what's happening in the corner of that park. Is that a place for a stormwater retention basin with natural ecosystems functions in there? Is that a place for biodiversity? Is that a place to think about where we can do some more cooling or irrigate it for cooling as well? So I think that's one of the more difficult ones, primarily because when we're talking active recreation, the way it's used and the prevalence of four-legged friends in Melbourne anyway. And the second one was...
Charismatic species.
Charismatic species, yes. I think there is a danger of that, but we also need to think about using them as, a focal species concept, so an umbrella species, so we can pick up other things behind there, and if we can do that, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But as ecologists, when we go through those biodiversity-sensitive urban design or other processes to select that, I think we need to be very conscious of not selecting the charismatic species. And I was going to use the example of the superb fairy wren in my talk, but I decided not to. And that could be an example of those characteristic species. So I think we definitely need to keep that in mind. There's definite benefits of doing that because you can appeal to people and they can be used as umbrella species, but we shouldn't be just focusing on the cute and cuddlies, because ugly things are important for conservation too.
Ooh, that's controversial. So snakes and spiders are not ugly. No. Claire or Freya, would you like to either add to your earlier comments or respond to those questions? We've got a couple of minutes left.
I think one thing that I was going to say is, yeah, it is useful to have a charismatic species because it hooks people in and, gets people interested. But lots of folks that I work with and know and chat to try and move away from species altogether, because we're thinking about characteristics and we're thinking about functional groups. And as we've heard in all the talks so far, it really, there's a lot of variation out there because there are species-specific or taxa-specific kind of things going on. So, I'm a plant ecologist, and I always, when people ask me, like, which are the top plants I should plant in my garden, you want a variety of objectives in your garden. You might want it to flower all year round, and you might love native bees, and you also might really love native wasps. And you can use those to select a palette of different species that will, hit all of those different objectives. So I think it comes down to, a values-based approach, knowing what you're after, and exploring the wide diversity of plants that we actually have available as well. Just learning more about them. And so we can actually use that knowledge in a really active way and learn about what works, particularly in cities. As a plant ecologist too, I always like reminding people that plants are inherent biodiversity in themselves as well. So just having lots of plants is great.
Totally agree with the last point. And maybe it's encouraging people to expect more from our public landscapes especially, mown turf everywhere. Is that really exciting? And so maybe a step forward, a little one, before we, really nail all the attributes of biodiversity and design. It's just encouraging people to plant more different things.
On that note, please thank our speakers and our panellists, Nick, Amy, Freya and Claire.